In the spring of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic forced offices around the globe to shutter their doors and send their employees home. But in the aftermath, one question that kind of echoed through the once buzzing halls of each and every now vacant firm was, how can we replicate the day-to-day of our office when the actual office is gone? In the wake of this great uncertainty, Microsoft Teams emerged as the collaboration platform to enable but also empower organizations with the tools necessary to establish their hybrid workplaces of the future. 145 million daily active users are now working through Teams, which is an astronomical rise from the 32 million just 1 year ago. So simply put, it's a Teams world now, and we're all just collaborating in it. Hi everyone, I'm the product marketing manager, Blerina Mike.
And I'm the content creator and copywriter, Mike Zawissa.
And this is ProsperoTune. Well, Mike, last time we kind of just did some housekeeping and explained why we're doing this podcast and what our mission is here at Prospero. I think this week will be a little bit different. We're going to be talking about the impact that Microsoft Teams has had on shaping the remote and now the hybrid workspace as it comes to the post-pandemic world, so to say. So we're also lucky to have Reggie Pool, the Senior Director of Information Governance at HBR Consulting, joining us later to talk about Teams as the great disruptor. But first, let's lay out the business case for Microsoft Teams. Right? So in just 1 year, Teams saw a 350% increase in its daily active user base, going from 32 million to 145 million over the course of the pandemic. And, with so many organizations having adopted Teams as their default messaging platform and more, which means that they have spent 3 billion minutes in different meetings, right? So not only is it proving Teams to be the favorite among organizations, but it's also separating itself from the competitors, right? Whether that's Zoom and Slack. And it's no wonder that Teams user base has grown by nearly 900% in the same time frame that we've seen, with the rise of Zoom and Slack during this time. And I have my own thoughts on why Teams has become such a staple of hybrid work now, but I also wanted to ask you for your take.
Yeah, so, obviously I'm a little less technical than you are, Blerina, so I'm, looking forward to you speaking about sort of some of the tools and everything as to why Teams has really taken off. But so I'm gonna try to look at it as more of a social maybe standpoint of why Teams has taken off. I'll flex my political philosophy degree here, put that to work. Mom and Dad, you're welcome. But yeah, so one of the things that stands out to me with Teams is, when looking at the breakdowns of who is using Teams in terms of an age demographic, if you subtract the 4% of users who are aged like 18 to 24, so that Gen Z crowd, young Gen Z or very young millennial crowd, who use it mostly for school, since, about 185,000 schools and universities are using Teams, you're left with the millennials, the boomers, and the Gen Xers. And out of that remaining, 96%, 45% of Teams users are millennials. They fall into that millennial age group. And that's easily the largest amount of the three. And I think that really says something. And I think that's partially because millennials have been interacting and communicating in virtual spaces since, they were kids, whether it's through stuff like AIM and AOL. I don't know if you remember AIM, Blerina, or
I think I do.
Other, yeah, right. Or even like we were the first ones to trailblaze like Facebook and MySpace and all that. I think that's part of it. Teams is almost like a contained social media app in a way. And then I think the second part of this is that this is this isn't a mistake. Teams is built to be collaborative like this. And in,
yes,
Microsoft's own Business Insights document, they pretty much comment explicitly about how they've designed Teams to be a, millennial centric workplace, or like a a workplace centered around a millennial way of doing things, which is, I mean, that's pretty transparent. I don't know if you would get a lot of companies saying that, at least that they're specifically working with the understanding that this millennial generation is now going to be, for at least the next few decades, the backbone of the workforce.
Yeah, and you mentioned the collaboration aspect of Teams, which I believe to be a huge part of it, from my opinion. And it's not just collaboration, it's real time collaboration. So you're stemming away from having to, I don't know, send emails in order to speak to your coworkers, right? Because we even use Teams here internally at Prospero, and we've seen a huge increase in productivity and the way you're able to collaborate with one another when you're using it. So it's the centralized hub for messaging, for whether formal or informal company communication, whether that's between groups or departments. And it becomes this huge bonus and a huge platform for any company using it.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it's basically eliminated the need for a lot of like third party apps or third party messaging apps, stuff like that. And it's not just a testament to how it's designed for millennial workforce, because if you look at the other, what, around 50% remaining of the pie chart for the other generations, like, this technology has to be adaptable and accessible for other generations as well. So, and I think it is. I, there's still a large portion of the workforce that is older than millennials that needs to use this technology too, and it's definitely extremely accessible.
Yeah. And, as you mentioned, I do think that the older generations are already extremely familiar with Microsoft, or, as was priorly known as Office 365. And they were pioneers, honestly. But do you think that this is going to continue with Gen Z now, too?
Yeah, I think it probably will, maybe just because, if for no other reason, this is just how business is going to be done now. I mean, like, you've got a lot of Gen Z now graduating from college and entering the workforce for the first time. And I mean, it's not like they're coming into these workforces and deciding what collaboration platform they're going to be using. Like, Teams, if it's already there, they're probably going to be using it. So, I mean, maybe if we get into more like, if that hybrid work split turns maybe like 70% in office, 30% out of office, maybe you'll see a shift towards other things. But I don't know. It just seems like Teams is here now, and Teams is in everything. So what about
That's true.
Yeah, exactly. But like, from a technical aspect though, like I said before, I know that you can probably answer those things more. What are like the tools or the specific feature sets that you think has allowed Teams to evolve like this?
Yeah, obviously Teams has a plethora of benefits and different features that has enabled it to rise to have this instrumental rise and supporting the remote work and now the hybrid work. It's first and foremost is the ease of collaboration that we kind of talked already about, but it's also the integration with Microsoft's 365. It's huge, like we talked about, and some of this is already a mention from our last episode, where our CEO Keith Lipman said that Microsoft is basically everything, and that's true. It's familiar, but then again, I believe the biggest reason for team success is the way it kind of centralizes all these processes, from internal to external communication and collaboration to file storage. Everything kind of happens within Teams. And on that note, that seems to be a good time to bring our special guest, Reggie Pool, to offer his take on the rise of Teams. Reggie Pool is the Senior Director of the Information Governance Practice within the advisory business at HBR Consulting. With over 26 years of litigation and legal tech experience under his belt, Reggie has written and worked on a wide variety of topics, ranging from information governance to the implementation and adoption of Microsoft 365 for legal. First off, Reggie, why don't you tell us what is your viewpoint on why we should embrace disruption?
I think based on what we're seeing in the industry and how people are reacting to the new normal, especially over the last year and a half with people working from home and the need to be able to collaborate remotely and control kind of that messaging. It's the we just have to figure out a new way of working, right? Traditionally, we've had so many siloed areas of storing content and trying to manage information in so many different level areas, is that when we now have an opportunity to embrace a new environment where we can kind of pull content together. I've had a lot of conversations with clients and a lot of conversations with them internally within my own group, and we're finding that having a central pane of glass, like when we're like in an example with Teams within 365, and having that as a central location, we're seeing such a change in how content's being managed, and centralizing everything into kind of a central one location, if you will, and the ability to pull content in from various sources. Right, no longer do we have to go out and look at various file shares or various systems, or looking at email, which is always going to be there, by the way. But being able to have more conversations in one location, it changes the way we actually interact with each other and how we manage that content. And I think that given today's world, how we're all separated, and while some of us are coming back together, having this as an opportunity to have a centralized collaboration platform, that kind of that change is important, and I think it's we as we adopt it and want to control it, makes a big difference.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, as you mentioned, Teams has kind of been at the center of all of this. And along with that has been also the pandemic as the key driver for, Teams adoption. So with that being said, why do you think that kind of, Teams has won over other solutions in the market, such as, let's say, Skype or Zoom, to support the remote work in the past, and now that we're moving to hybrid work, support it?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and a couple of factors have filtered into that, right, or factored into that, I should say. One is Microsoft's kind of end of life of Skype for Business Online, and that push for Teams to be that natural replacement. And then we start looking at what Teams really means to an organization. And then Teams was kind of the answer to other solutions out there like Slack from Microsoft. But Microsoft has such a strong footprint in the business world, and people are so used to collaborating and working within the Microsoft environment, especially within 365, that Teams has been a natural progression. When I talk to our clients, it's always funny to ask them a question of, how are you using Teams today, right? Are you adopting Teams? Have you adopted Teams? And most of the time they'll say, yes, absolutely. We're using Teams. But then you ask the next question, which is, how are you using Teams? Because most organizations, they've adopted Teams because of the pandemic to have that collaboration, that Skype replacement, that Zoom replacement for meetings and chats and all that. But a lot of them haven't fully adopted what we call the Teams workspace environment, where you're creating a team within Teams, and that piece, like the Slack, that real Slack competitor piece, is really where we're seeing some of the heaviest adoption. And I think Microsoft has really positioned itself very well, because Teams ends up being that centralization. I call it like the next step in terms of pulling together content that would normally have been in SharePoint, would have been in Exchange, would have been in inside of OneDrive, and kind of centralizing all that content into a Teams collaboration workspace. And because it becomes that single pane of glass, it's kind of has a real kind of lead in terms of pulling all the traditional Microsoft content together.
And when you mentioned like the Teams being the collaboration platform, do you think that that's the push that has, driven law firms into using Teams and continue to do so and adopt more and more as we move along?
So, as a collaboration, I think so. I think we're seeing a kind of a rapid adoption of Teams. As I said, I kind of look at Teams as bifurcated, right? There's the Teams, which is the replacement for Skype for Business Online, that chat and meetings and that area, and then we have that Teams kind of workspace content. And immediately we see a lot of law firms have adopted the Teams from a Skype replacement, and for chat and meetings, but the slower adoption of the Teams for the workspace, the Teams where you have your channels and your posts and your conversations and your file sharing, etc., because that's much more of a change in the way that law firms are working. And then we have to think about that internally as well as what does it mean to collaborate internally within the firm and externally. And with that, with our clients, that when we're working with them, we're trying to help them establish the right strategy to leverage teams appropriately, so that the firm can really take advantage of that collaborative environment. Does that answer? I'm hoping I'm answering your question correctly, Belinda.
Yes, absolutely. And I think Mike had also, follow up question when it comes to that too.
Yeah, I did. I like what you said about obviously sort of the shuttering of Skype for Business being, a driver as Microsoft wants to make sure that Teams sort of takes up that mantle and can begin to challenge, other platforms like Slack, for that really, I mean, you see like almost like stratified communication, like you said, like every Teams has multiple teams, like, so,
Right.
but I think what you also just mentioned, that level of like client driven communication and adoption is kind of new. Like firms and organizations are now encountering clients that are requesting the use of Teams. Does that sort of reason for adoption surprise you, or have you seen similar things in the past, like clients actually paving the way for new adoption of these collaboration tools?
Yeah, I think that it is kind of a natural progression, right? Honestly, when we work with our law firm clients and we look at how they're adopting teams or why they're adopting teams, there's kind of a threefold piece, right? There is that Slack, or that Skype replacement piece, and then there's the general kind of adoption, kind of driving, like they're hearing it from their clients. The clients are already using this technology, and a lot of the attorneys are being invited into client teams to do the work, and they're recognizing that when they do that work and they create that work product in a client team, that content lives in that teams. And so, I've been fortunate enough to work with the law firm Information Governance Symposium, or LFIGS, and I work with a lot of IG leaders within law firms today, and we're working on a paper right now that addresses collaboration, right? And it talks
Mm-hmm.
about, okay, what do you do when you have to work in a client environment? Like, what are the processes that need to be put in place? And there's such a risk and such a concern around the fact that work product now lives in another location in the client's cloud and the client's teams and their tenant. Like, what are the things they need to think about? But the client's driving that, and so firms are having to think to themselves, what do we need to do to react to that? Can we have our own environment where we control the messaging, we control the development of those documents, and we have control of that content? And so I think that's really important, Mike. But one of the other, like the third area where I see a lot of the driving of the adoption is the younger generation of attorneys that are coming in, right?
Mm.
They're more, and it's generational, and they're more apt to want a more collaborative tool set, collaborative communication system where, email to them is old school. Many of them don't, they're not really focusing in on the use of email for their private cloud. If outside the office, they don't use email a lot. They use
Yeah.
chats and communications. And so they're really driving a push, or have a push or driving change within firms to say, we want the most recent, the most up-to-date technology solutions so we can do our jobs more effectively. And so I
I
think
mean,
that's interesting to see how that's driving it as well.
absolutely. I mean, that's pretty wild when you think about how powerful the incoming generation can be into the market. We've kind of been in this period the last, I don't know, 5-10 years in the US specifically, where younger generations are told, like, well, there's not as many opportunities, you might have to take a couple positions here and there that to build up. But then we're seeing in some fields, like you're saying, with firms, where the younger generation is actually driving and trailblazing this new way of doing work. It's kind of like you mentioned in the Embracing Disruption white paper that the pandemic was the great interrupter, then Microsoft Teams has been the great disruptor. And it's a great comparison, because just like the pandemic forced us to take stock in our own personal lives, Microsoft for Teams has basically made us, I wouldn't say overhaul how we do remote work, hybrid work, etc., but it's definitely had us at least reevaluating how we're doing some of these things.
I think that's really important. And I think firms are having to really now address the use of these collaboration tools, and the fact that Teams is kind of a disruptor. I mean, there's always going to be that place for the legal DMS and that document management solution. But then what happens when you bring in something like a Teams and then people start defaulting to that being that single place where they like to do their communication and their chats and their document creation and co-authoring and things you can do in a Teams workspace that's natural, right? At mentioning someone and bringing them directly into a document when you're ready to talk to them about that, co-authoring on that document, sharing that content. It all stays there. I mean, we see firms that, some firms are trying to successfully integrate their document management system directly into Teams and sharing content and determining how those different systems of records work together. Other firms are saying, you know what, we're going to recognize Teams as being a separate location where content can live. So we need to manage content effectively in Teams, but also manage it effectively within our legal DMS, right? So it's I'm kind of jumping around topics a little bit, Mike, but I'm seeing that kind of as part of that disruption and having to really think about how do we address these different repositories in different areas where people want to be able to work. And I'll bring it back around by saying I work with a lot of organizations. I work with corporations as well as within law firms. And I can tell you and I'm on the West Coast, and so we see very technically, very technology focused, bleeding edge kind of organizations. Those organizations that have adopted Teams or Slack or for those collaboration platforms, they're seeing a reduction in email usage of up to anywhere from 60, 70, sometimes 75% internal email usage, right? Where they're no longer relying on email as being their communication method. They're basically utilizing Teams and Teams messaging, threaded messages, et cetera. And it's really reducing the amount of email that's being generated by the firm, which has, compounding effect in terms of e-discovery and data placement and control and retention, et cetera. So it just has to change the way the firm looks at how they're managing that content.
Yeah. And I think you're bringing up a very valid point when it comes to this, because we have been using Teams internally here at Prospero too, and we have seen a decrease in, when it comes to using email for instant collaboration. So we just use Teams for everything, and we kind of, also present as one of our best practice being that, hey, use Teams for whenever you have important client external, communication, and let's do real-time collaboration in Teams instead.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that's a really big consideration. And then you have to think about it. What does that really mean? We help organizations kind of look at that and say, okay, how do you integrate this in? How do you take something like a Teams, which is going to be new to the firm or to the company, and say, how do you manage that content? How do you manage that information that comes out of Teams effectively? And because Teams is it's grown so quickly that, most organizations, this reminds me back when SharePoint first came out. Many firms or many organizations would kind of turn it loose and say, hey, you can create these really cool new content management sites, and it just exploded. And SharePoint was everywhere. And so, and being in the industry, we spent a lot of time helping people get control over something that had already happened, like the number of SharePoint sites that have been abandoned, had been created, content's going everywhere. And so we're seeing the same kind of thing when we're looking at Teams today in terms of organizations. Let's not talk about law firms, but overall, if they didn't put a governance plan in place or a way of controlling and managing that content in place up front, we're working with corporations that we're having to come back after the fact and deciding how do we control all these Teams we've allowed to happen during the last year and a half, and what kind of controls can we put in place here to where we have more thoughtful provisioning, thoughtful ways of controlling and managing that content. And it's really been a big challenge.
What a great conversation, Mike.
Yeah, it makes me wish there was more.
Well, Mike, you're in luck. Next episode will be featuring part 2 of our interview with Reggie, where we will get into the topic of Teams governance. But in the meantime, we hope you enjoyed today's episode and give us a follow on LinkedIn, Twitter, and make sure you also check out our Knowledge Center on our website. If you're feeling extra daring, please hit the subscribe button and leave us a rating whenever you listen. For Mike, I'm Blerina, and this is ProsperoTune.